Good evening. My name is David Gleason, and I'm chairman of the 2017 lecture series, which brings us here this evening. So I have to read my notes here because I could never remember what it is that I should say. But I should welcome you to the Preservation Society's 2017 lecture series commemorating the incorporation of Fells Point, Jones Town, and Baltimore Town in 1797 to form Baltimore City. This unique series will highlight the remarkable and highly improbable survival of two small Wolfe Street houses constructed in that year, and through that lens, the history and achievements of the African American community associated with the houses through the first half of the 19th century. It is particularly appropriate to mark the 220th anniversary of the incorporation of Baltimore City, for in this year, 2017, it also marks the 50th anniversary of the formation of the Preservation Society by a group of visionary individuals who saw the potential and value of the great social history and architectural heritage of Fells Point, and at that time was being threatened by the proposed federal highway through the most historic core of the neighborhood. Through that organization, the Preservation Society was successful in defeating the highway alignment through Fells Point and providing guidance in its redevelopment and revival. Today, the success of those initial efforts at preservation have provided opportunities for growth and development that have contributed to the continued vitality of Fells Point and the city of Baltimore. In Saturday's Baltimore Sun, Jock Kelly writes of the rebirth of the Recreation Pier as a premier hotel venue in the city. Kelly describes the formation of the building from a decaying industrial waterfront property into one of the city's newest and most memorable locations. As he ends his article, he comments on the continuous and consistent efforts of preservationists that have provided this opportunity to restore and revitalize this great historic landmark. Kelly writes, "As I left Sagamore Pendry, I glanced across Thames Street and spotted another historic building, a commercial structure newly named to honor Lucretia Fisher. Lou Fisher was a principal player in 1967 in the successful fight to save Fells Point and much of Baltimore's harbor from an interstate highway. We learned amazing lessons about preservation in the intervening 5 decades, and we're seeing some remarkable benefits today. This lecture series will continue the Preservation Society's mission of providing amazing lessons in preservation and its remarkable benefits." So with that, this lecture series is dedicated to the memory of Tom Ward and Bob Eny, both who provided immeasurable direction and guidance for the Preservation Society and the mission that they undertook. With that, I'd like to introduce Bryan Blundell, a noted architectural preservationist, and Bryan has been involved with this project since 2004. So with that, I'd like to welcome Bryan, and please welcome him to this lecture series.
Thank you. And if you can't hear me, just say louder. And if you can't understand me, can't do anything about that. And so basically what I intend to do is to hopefully take you through the process that we've been dealing with from 2004 up to the current time. And just like all the home improvement shows, it'll be done in 45 or 35 minutes, and that the project's complete. So, don't think you can do this at home. And so in 2004, I was invited to come and take a look at these houses by Peter Paris. I think he felt that there was something he had to get back at me for. I wasn't sure. And in walking into these two little buildings, I was amazed. I tend to really like old, rotten, forgotten places It is a situation where you can look at a building and see it, in my terms, with its clothes off. You get to look through the walls, you get to look through the dirt that's on the floor, and half the dirt on the floor is historic. And a lot of people, all they see is damage and dirt. But what I see is an opportunity to learn something, because it's the story that we want these buildings to tell us. That's the interesting part. And so to begin with, this is the front in 2004, January 22nd. And that's the back. And what you see on the left-hand side, that is not a wall, that's a barrier to keep you from going into the building, because the back wall doesn't exist. We don't think of these buildings as ruins. We have to have a more open mind when we look at these things. And they've been named various things over time. They were called wooden houses by the Historic Preservation City Commission and by the Maryland Trust. They were the Wolfe Street houses, that's an obvious one. The Two Sisters, for the Two Sisters, the DeShield sisters that were part of the activity that David mentioned to get things started and protect Fells Point from the highway. And the caulkers houses. And the caulkers houses are a good name for two reasons. One is that in the 1840s and 50s, we have documented that black ship's caulkers lived there. Also, the African American grant money helped fund a lot of work, so those are two very good reasons. And so in 2005, the Society acquired these buildings from the DeShield family. And right away, if you notice where the arrow is up there saying November 29, 2006, is when the new plat was created. So now, having acquired these buildings, they are no longer forgotten buildings. They are now owned by the Preservation Society. And so you have to start thinking of these as resources. And so you have to think about how to protect them and what are your guidelines. It's now this serious process that you have to go into. And why are the buildings important? You have to think about what it is that makes you want to save them, and what are your guiding principles. I won't go into any of that because the society has started up a friends group to help with these houses, and the friends group has to set these guidelines. And so I don't want to step on any toes there. We have to think of these buildings as investments. We have to think of them how they involve the city now and how they've involved the city in the past. There's a huge amount of educational information that these buildings hold. And it's our efforts to try and turn these into useful members of society again. Notice the arrow pointing to a date. Wasn't that basically a year before the plat was done? But as soon as the transfer of title was, somebody knew that there was somebody responsible for these buildings, and a notice went up saying you better do something. So in starting all of this, we have to be careful that in the process that we go through, we don't destroy what it is we're trying to save. And if for no other reason, the society would be pissed, I would think. Yeah. So the first thing that was done was to go in and look at supporting these buildings to keep them from falling down. That was a true concern. And so a system of supports were put into each building. And at the time, it was done with a quick visit and a decision. James Madison Cutt was assisting us at this point. And we didn't do a thorough investigation of the building, and we'll see the consequences of that coming up. The first thing that has to be done when people say, we want to restore this building is, what's that mean? Anybody have an idea what restore a building means? It can mean 50 different things, and how you decide to restore it typically is based on who's got the bucks. And we have a situation with this building that we didn't have bucks. And so just like a lot of grand old houses are now treasures because the family ended up not having bucks, and so things weren't changed. So we've had to go through a very deliberate process with the limited funds, and where you start with that is to do research. I have to know what's important and what's not important before I know whether I can take it out or stiffen it up or what to do with it. And so it was 105 pages of a report with different areas of interest. And so you start off with going in and documenting existing conditions. And as we go through, we actually put into the report additional things that we think at that time in 2005 and 6, what we think additional things need to be researched. Now, if I went back and edit this, I would probably have another 105 pages of additional things. Documenting who the owners were, because we have owners, we have the Fells owning the land, we have people owning the rights to the land, and we have people renting the property and living on it. And so we recorded existing molding details and recording changes that we're making. But here's the interesting part right here, and that we have documentation of black ship's caulkers living in these houses, basically a block away from the shipyards. And also, this is an area that needs to be delved into more. I believe the ship's caulkers union was basically controlled by the black community. And so this really ties in very interestingly to free blacks in Baltimore, these two little houses. You see the question marks above and below. If we can find out who lived there in the 30s, that may have some interesting impacts for us. And in the research, you also have to realize that everything changes. And so street names, Thames wasn't Thames, Thames was George. And so you have to be able to learn what the vocabulary is and how it's changed over time. And then to sort of put these houses into perspective, it's fun to sort of do a timeline. And I've sat down before and just, who was king and who was this and who invented that and what did Edison do? And it's interesting that these little houses survived all of these evolutions and changes in society. And so we have creation of Fells Point, the building of the houses. If we can find out who lived in the 30s in the houses, in the 40s and 50s, the African American ship caulkers. And of course for Baltimore, the invention of the bottle cap on beer bottles. Very important in Baltimore. And you have World War II, you have the War of 1812, you have all these things that these two little houses can represent in various ways. This is the second addition to Fells Point. So this is where the land was divided for these houses. Now, 1792, that's Fells Point. You see the black arrow, that's where the houses would be. You see the shaded in areas, that's where buildings exist at that time. 1797, when we think the houses were built, is when the Constellation was built in the shipyard 1 block away. Kind of puts it into perspective a little bit. We go, oh, look at that old derelict house. Well, if the Constellation was sitting on its side on the banks, we go, oh, that's pretty neat. So we have something that is important. 1797, the houses have been built. You see the shaded area up where the yellow dot is. That inlet still exists. This is the dog park. That's the post office. That's where we are. So when we go out and walk, make sure you don't get your feet wet over there. This is 1822. The coastline's been filled in. Anybody have soggy basements? I wonder why. 1836. You have railroads, you have railroad depots, you have ship docks over here. You have a hub of industry and transportation, and you have Frederick Douglass 1 block away from these two houses, working in the shipyard 1 block away from the two houses. If we can find that in the 1830s we have African American ship caulkers living in the houses, I'd be willing to bet plug your ears, my wife is here. I'd be willing to bet a whole lot of money that Frederick Douglass went into those houses and socialized, that he was there. Doesn't that put a new, interesting twist to those derelict little buildings? Ship's caulkers tools. And if you guys don't know what ship's caulkers do, there are stories that you read where the team of ship caulkers will have a leader. And just like a lot of manual labor in those days, you would have a call and reply type singing going on to help the rhythm of all the work. And wouldn't it be interesting to have that recreated for a videotape? A student with the University of Maryland's preservation program was working with me on the houses for a while, and he wrote an article that was published by the National Trust. And so we are getting some more research done on the houses, and it would be great to be able to team up with some of the universities and also the high schools to see what kind of programs we can get rolling. 1851. This yellow dashed line is a trolley car. I have a hard time believing that those were derelict little houses in 1851 with Metro, the subway, being a half a block away. These, to me, it must have been a fairly prime spot to have been in. This is today. This, if we walk over and up Wolfe Street, that's the path we followed. That's where the water was. Kind of is interesting to look at that as if you're walking past the dog park, you know, you're pulling your pant legs up to make sure you're not getting wet. The post office is got water behind it. So it's interesting to see how the, let's go back. See how much has been filled in? So, where are we? So this has all been filled in, right there. All right, when you're dealing with a building like this, you have to build on the efforts of people who have come before you. And it's not that people do things wrong, it's that information hasn't come to light. And so you're always in doing this process, I call it the data, information, knowledge, wisdom process. We have data, and data is, it's clear, it's sort of cylindrical, it's got bubbles, it's kind of golden color. If I had never had a beer, I wouldn't know what it was. But since I have experience, I know that it's beer. I have more experience, and I know I can drink it. That's knowledge. So I go from data to information to knowledge, and I even have wisdom because I know if I drink 10 bottles of it, I'll be drunk. So I can predict the future, and that's what people are looking for when you go through this process. Now, if somebody comes along and puts water in there, and I don't know it, and I go drink, 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 and then I look and go, it's clear. That's a new piece of data that I now have to reinterpret all of what I had figured on before, and I'll come out with a new conclusion. So in this process, it is a process of discovery all the time. And so here's what we have now. This is Bob Eney's rendering of what he interpreted to be. This is what we think it actually was originally. And if you imagine our two little buildings connected to a fourplex, and we have reasons for thinking this, and it's that data process. And if that is timber frame with brick nogging in between and plaster coating on the outside called rendering. And so what we have is we have a Tudor style look. So it's Old English. So if we go inside behind the front door, we have some examples of brick nogging still in place. So we have the brick nogging, we have the rendering on the back side, which used to be on the front side of the exterior, and we have the neighbor's brickwork. from their house. We have in the south wall a window, south wall, first floor, we have a window, and you can see the riglet where the window actually slid into the opening. So we know that it was a wall that looked out to daylight. So there had to be enough space between it and the next building, so we now are pulling together our data points and trying to figure out what it all means. Matthew Mosca, who's in the audience here, came in and helped reveal more data. He took a piece of that plaster that had been on the exterior of the wall, and there's the piece that he absconded with, a little bigger than a quarter. There's a better picture. And so this is the mortar of the plaster. That's the coatings. So we're talking 1/16 of an inch. And there's Matthew, diligently working on his itty-bitty little speck of paint. And what does it tell us? It tells us the first coat of paint on this piece of wood probably could not have happened before 1850. Okay? So that reinforces, that's another piece of data that reinforces the idea that this was not a sited building. The sited building didn't happen in 1797. We think now, our assumption, we don't know a fact, we are assuming now that it was sited in 1850. Isn't that the same time as the trolley? Isn't that the time of people going, oh, that's a nice place to live, I think I'll buy it and redo it, just like we do nowadays. So it fits that kind of norm. And we have all sorts of other things that we can easily see. Under the back roof of 614, we have original shingles, wood shingles. And I took one off. The two nails holding that shingle in was the only holes in the wood below. So it tells us it's the first. There were no on top of it, so this addition on the back was added pretty soon afterwards. You know, if we could get somebody to date dirt for us, and they could look at the dirt on the shingles, maybe we could come up with an estimate of how long that was exposed. And what you have on the front is these coarse shakes. Anybody worth their salt who put on the shingles is rolling in their graves because somebody put shakes on this roof. Shakes are just the split wood. Shingles, somebody has taken a draw knife and smoothed them out. A world of difference from a quality of product point of view. So lots of people think rustic is the way to go when you're doing old. Boy, you're embarrassing so many historic craftspeople when you do that. So this is where we think we are right now, that we had a 4-building unit. In between, let's start from the south, in between the southern unit and the next unit, there is a chimney plus a wood board wall covered with lath and plaster. Between the next two units, it's a board wall, lath and plaster on both sides. Between the next two units, we're back to the mirror image of the first two with the chimney and a common chimney. And these existed in the Sanborn maps of 1890. There are 4 little houses. Story and a half, just like we have. We have additions on them. You know, if we can dig and find more data, more documentation, you know, those photos from 1801, ha ha ha. Who knows what we can discover. Here we have 1901. The 2 buildings are gone. There, 1910, we can see our 2 buildings. Look what we have here. Talking about our 4 buildings. We have 1, 2, 3, 4, a 6-foot walk alley, 1, 2, 3, 4. We had 5 buildings lining that street. Can we assume that they were on both sides? I don't know. It sure seems nice to say that. And to think of walking down that dirt street with this Tudor style, I'm sure they wouldn't have called it Tudor back then, but this Tudor style, and doesn't it make you sort of think you're in merry old England back in the medieval times? Completely different look for the neighborhood. So there would be where your walk alley would be in the next building. That's the building that's still there. This building has been so remodeled, it's only in shell, an outline of its historic building, but it is one of those repeated units from the corner quadplex. 1930. And as we look at these, even here, small window, large window. So when was the window changed? Was it that the large window was a replacement, or have both of them been replaced? So big window, small window. Here we still have our wood siding. Dave talked about the highway trying to come through. It was stopped 1960. Here's 1972. Brick buildings, asphalt rolled siding. You know, it's the aluminum siding on brick walls sort of thing. You can see a little wave in the roof. You can see that it's got shake roofing instead of shingles, smooth shingles. And we believe they were lived in until 1985. One of the days I was working there, I had a woman poke her head in and go, "I used to play with the little girl that lived in this house." "Really?" "Oh yeah, I'm just down seeing my mom 3 doors down," or whatever it was. And you know, I didn't go and say, "Write your name down, give me your phone number." But it's amazing how many people popped in and had a little story to tell. It'd be wonderful to try and get neighborhood people giving you their oral history. And you always look at oral history as possibly true, but it's an interesting place to start. You know, and a lot of times the oral information is golden. In 1992, University of Delaware, under Bernie Herman, is going to give a talk, and he and his students came and documented the building in 1992. And when they did it, that addition behind 612 still existed. So between 92 and 2004, it went someplace. You know, so this is an evolving process. So now I'm going to try and run through quickly what's been done. Now that we have a plat, we start to understand the building and the site. First, photographic documentation, and Bill Leibowitz, who's a photographer and architectural historian, did the Habs quality documentation and photographs. All right, so we now have a plat. The yellow is the backyard. All the other neighbors had taken the alley. The site hadn't taken the alley yet, so that's that red dashed line. So we took the alley. And that meant that we had to designate the property and to keep the confines of the society's responsibilities, and hopefully try and keep out some of the trash by putting up a fence. So the trees had to be taken down, and those required having a crane to lift them up because you couldn't haul them through the houses. And the stump that was still there, some of it had to be hatcheted out and others could be chainsawed, but ended up doing a board and batten fence because that would have been an appropriate fence for that time period. And every time I go, I take pictures. I forget the number, I think it's 7,000 pictures that I have between 2004 and now. And you take the same thing over and over and over again. But when you do that, how do you like that zipper? I don't know if you can see that, but that chimney is slowly trying to work its way out, and look what they had shoring it up. That's 2 2x4s nailed together to get the length. And that's what was holding it up. And it was replaced with our 2 diagonal support system, and it still moved a little bit. This is the front of the building too, yeah. And so one of the things that was done is the society wanted to clean it up. I recommend if you have a historic site and you want to clean it up, first you clean it. Rag and water and just wash it off, because that probably does the trick. Another layer of paint is not the answer normally. Think about the paint on this siding and look at all the layers of paint. And again, you can, from the side view, you can barely see it. And there's all that information that somebody with the right data, experience, and knowledge can now interpret. Right off the bat, we wanted to support the rear of the 614 because underneath there is where the original shingles are. So we don't want that roof moving. So as a first precaution, we did a temporary support system. To fill in some gaps, we just closed up the gap with a new piece of siding. To try and lift that wall, the termites have had such a good time with that wall, you would destroy it by trying to move it. The roof was cleaned. So we got a lift so that we could not put any pressure on the roof, because we had no idea if we got up on the roof whether we could not go through. So we got a lift and from the top down cleaned it and then covered it with a application of bore care to slow the reappearance of growth. A door was put into the back wall, which is not the back wall of the house, it's the back wall of keeping people out of the house. The back wall of the house is actually, if it were there, would be 3 feet further out. And that becomes part of the problem because there was this partition there that when you walk around inside, you think, oh, that's a wall, right? Well, the wall stops here, the joists stop leaning out, the rafters, all the ends were rotted, so that roof started to move. I'll get to that in a second, but so the door was put in. So the door at the back of 614 was blocked in such a way you could open it for air, but we have horizontals there to keep people from walking through. Because believe it or not, 614 is our sacred space. You can see here we have a man lift, a personnel lift, in order to support the ladder in order to work on the roof. And some shingles were replaced. Here we used shingles instead of shakes. And I talked about the back wall that's not the back wall, and the joists that are sticking beyond, and the rafter and joist detail that's rotted away. And so that roof started moving, and so taking pictures all the time, you can see it's good, not so good, worse, 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 worse. No money. No way to arrest this because there wasn't any funding. And so it's great that we can document it. We can show that it happened. It would have been nice to have had a system in place. A temporary set of walls were put inside to keep it from moving any further, and it has arrested it since then. And a lot of what's been done so far, you can't tell that it's been done, except maybe the paint job if you happen to remember the previous color. And that becomes a visual problem for the public because they assume nothing's happening. Nobody cares. It's falling apart. You can't imagine how many times people would stick in their head and say, why are you letting this place fall apart? We're not. Yeah. If you could only see what we're doing. So, do you think that there was a roof leak on the back of this roof? The chimney had collapsed in on itself and everything was going with it. And so what was done was a dormer was superficially built just to sit over everything because there was no way to repair the roof. And so putting it into a holding pattern, we built a dormer in order to shed the water off. And then on the back addition roof, we put down some plywood and some rolled roofing to reduce leakage there. All of the joists in the building, we had to sort of figure out whether we could rely on them for any kind of support or not. And so we do this drilling technique to be able to interpret what's going on inside a piece of wood. So every place you see shading, it's non-structural. And so basically nothing as far as the joists you can rely on from a structural point of view. None of it fell down because between the joists and the flooring and everything else being a system, it all helps each other, but you are not, it's not something you can jack it up in place and put a shim here and shim there and then rent it out for $1,000 a month. For the 614, I'm sort of not telling you why we're doing these things, and I'll give you a peek right now. We're thinking that 614 is it's not a ruin, remember that one of the first slides. It's not a ruin, it's an architectural artifact that we are preserving, okay? That's a completely different vocabulary. And so we've put in this support system, which supports the first floor and up to the second floor, and we had to do 6 footers, and so archaeology was done. I didn't mention that archaeology was done prior to the fence, 2 test pits. There was over 6,000 artifacts out of 2 test pits. But here, luckily, 3 of the footers that we were putting in for the support system were through a builder's trench for the plumbing that had been run into the house. So we were pretty lucky there. One of the footers actually revealed the foundation for the fireplace in that side. So what is on 614 right now is a stovepipe connection is what you see, but there's actually the side footers for a fireplace is what it looks like. Again, these are bits of data we find, and we make assumptions as we go along. So our support system goes up into the second floor through the flooring and under the roof out near the eaves. In order to show this is an important space, we put a little footpath. And here you can see the fiberglass up there, the fiberglass material that we used instead of steel. We didn't want to have to weld. We didn't want to have extra weight lugging around and dropping it against things. And we used fiberglass shapes that were in the shape of steel. And it's the same material they use for oil rigs out in the Gulf of Mexico and that sort of thing. On 612, we had to reinforce that roof. The idea is that 614 is our saved space, 612 is partially collapsed. And so the idea is that 612 will be rebuilt. And the hope is that it'll have a facade. And so the front wall somehow will stay in place. The front roof will stay in place, but the front roof isn't where it's supposed to be. And so we set up a system that if all goes well, we could push that roof back up into place. And in doing that, you have to start at the ground, so we had to take out the flooring in order to give ourselves the support we needed. We couldn't build it on top of the floor. And so we labeled everything, took it out, wrapped it, and we have it in storage in a trailer. And the question that I don't have an answer for is, was this a dirt floor originally, or was it a wood floor originally? Because here you have your timbers. It may be hard to see, but there you have a mortise and tenon joint. You actually have a trundle, a tree nail, sticking out the end, which would be appropriate for that time period. It would be appropriate for the light timber frame that we see. It's hard for me to think that they were originally wood floors, though, and that's just my bugaboo, and I have no facts or anything to back up. But it becomes a real question because we found that was a little medicine jar. And if you go back and read the ingredients, you go on the internet and find it, read the ingredients, it was used for everything. And I forget what it had in it. It had mercury or something good for you in it. It was for your eyes, it was for your nose, we found in front of the fireplace in 612 a huge amount of oyster shells. Not anywhere else, but in that first little framing bay right in front of the hearth. If there was a wood floor, how'd they get there? You know, the other thing I don't know in this is that when these additions happened, so maybe the floor was not original. If the floor wasn't original, there are people, there's a guy who I know up in, is it Connecticut, Central or Connecticut State University, who does African American folk charms, I'll call them, that were the traditions that they brought over for their living spaces, such as you would put some sort of charm in the flue, because that's where the spirits went up to heaven, was through the flue. You did something at the front door under the threshold. So it would be interesting to have somebody who's an expert at that once we get a better feeling for who lived there when, and when the renovations, when the changes were made. And could we find some of these more little details that sort of add a whole new personal life to it? So in that same 612, the supports had to go up through the floor. There it goes through the floor, sticking up through, and then we built a platform and then built a triangular shape that if we lifted that triangular shape, hopefully we can get that wood back into place. One of the things that was done as a courtesy by Direct Dimensions, and they've offered to do additional scanning for the building. And for a building like this where straight, square, plumb, level is all fantasy, this 3D scanning is the way to go to get accurate drawings. And to do the scanning is inexpensive. To do this flyby takes a little bit of effort. To really scrub the data and come up with a really useful product, that's where your investment falls in. So you can do 3D scanning and not have a huge investment, and if the money's in becomes available, you can use that data set. So I think it's something that should be done for all threatened buildings, is to go in and scan and just have that data set available for the future. So what's the plan? And this is what I came up with because I couldn't think of any other way to meet the requirements of the easements on the project and to sort of respect the building. There's no way you can turn this into a rental property without destroying it. You might as well just have at it and tear it down if that's going to be the case. So the thought is you have our conserved architectural artifact. The north unit becomes the interpretive space. Since it's partially collapsed, let's go ahead and take it apart, rebuild it using traditional materials and techniques, recording that, working with students in the city and all that, so that, you know, maybe do the restore cam or something like that, so people can see the process that would be used back in those days. In that same line, every time something's fallen off the building when I was working on it, I put it in a plastic container and it went off to the storage unit. So if we ever get around to having a material lab, which I'll talk about in a minute, we'll have plaster from this building that the kids could dissolve and look at the sand and look at the hair and see how it was made. So in this space, with the new TVs that are thin and huge, we could have a magic wall here. The rear addition becomes a demonstration space, just a raw space. This makes the whole thing work, this material lab. To bring the utilities from here to here, the ditch could cost $100,000. That's the archaeology, if we have that same sort of richness of artifacts. But in that lab, you could do meetings, you could do special classes for kids. The city has no place to deal with archaeological artifacts coming out of digs. This could be a processing place as an interim space. There's lots of things that could be done. So we start off with the research space. There's who knows how many generations of wallpaper. There's plaster that is on split lath. There's plaster that's on sawn lath. There's wainscoting that's been put in that is obviously not original. There's different details of woodwork that appear to be original and some appear not to be original. All of this can be researched. The bricks, if somebody really went in and analyzed the bricks, could we figure out which brick site the bricks came from? You know, in that space you could have chaperoned high school students. You could have college students doing papers. You could have PhD or graduate PhD actually doing research on the space. So this is the footprint of the space we're talking about. This is the garret, the second story. And it is off kilter. You'll feel drunk standing in the space because it's a little sloped. But it's amazing how much original material is there. Oh, you know, when I first walked in there and everybody's moaning about the appearance, I'm looking around going, holy moly, this is great. The living space, the museum space, all right, from Americans with Disability Act, this is a horrible building. How can you deal with that? Well, you can deal with it because you put in that magic wall. And then you can open the door and have a glass, let's say, storm door. The people can look in and they can see all the things that could be explained on that magic wall. They can peek in the window, and all of it is accessible to everybody. What's not accessible is the space in the back if we do that addition with the material lab, but without the material lab, none of this is possible. What would it be without that addition that has the new utilities in it? We can also set it up so that people can come by with their smartphone and go beep, 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 and the movie starts for whatever it is they want to see. All sorts of possibilities now. And then the material lab. It just opens up the door for all sorts of possibilities, and it happens to take up the same amount of space as previous editions. So you get the point of the material lab. I think it could be a lot of fun, and also being in a neighborhood, we're going to be limited to how many people should show up without disturbing the neighborhood, but the spaces are so small, that's not an issue, because you're not going to be allowed to have very many people as far as the fire marshal's concerned. And then the yard. That yard becomes part of the extension of how people lived during that time period. I think the idea of having archaeology there is probably not the way to go. I think having it as whatever it is you do, you know, boil apples, cook crabs, you know, whatever people do in their backyards of whatever time period you pick. And the people who have been on the team this whole time include Peter Perry, and I don't think Peter's here tonight, James Madison Cutt, who's not around anymore, Dave Wallace is the structural engineer, myself, Doug Comer was the archaeologist, and then it was Esther Reed. Matthew Moss has done all of our paint analysis, 3D or direct dimensions of the 3D scanning, and Bill Leibowitz has done the photography.
Bryan, would you entertain some questions?
Oh, sure.
If anybody has a question from the audience? Yes.
So how much is it going to cost to fix it completely?
Do you know what you want to do?
No, I mean, let's just say you do what you want to do. What's your goal? If Bill Gates was sitting in here.
If Bill Gates, all right, I think the building itself is if you do the building without a full program, you've wasted your money. And so you put a gun to my head and say, how much for the bill? And I go, you know, $500,000, $700,000, I don't know. You know, it's not a big building, it's gonna be tedious. Then you throw in that $100,000 for your trench, you know, there'll be lots of things you don't realize. But then you probably need just as much for your programming. You know, you wanna get school teachers involved, you wanna be able to take kids down there and talk about the changing of a neighborhood. How did people live back then? What was it that they did? You know, in the back, we think we know where one of the privies was. Also, the wall of the rear addition on 614 has a place where there used to be a door, so those two buildings used to be common one-family living, we're assuming. You know, so there's all these changes where you can talk about families, you can talk about communities, you can talk about immigration. So from, you know, first grade on up, there's all sorts of possibilities. And that would make this building alive. Without that programming, it's another piece of whatever that's sucking money out of a society someplace.
Thank you for your presentation. It was so informative. Two questions. You said there were over 3,000 artifacts that were recovered.
6,000.
6,000. So I'm curious.
Oops, just a great job. I think that's what it was. Yeah.
I'm curious where they are. And secondly,
I think Doug Comer has it.
who
Doug Comer,
and who's that?
he's an archaeologist here in Baltimore.
And then my second question is, you said you felt like it wasn't a good, or I thought I heard you say you felt like it wasn't a good idea to look at archaeology for the backyard. I would like to understand your thinking.
I'm not an archaeologist, and
Neither am I.
I love old rotten buildings. I hate it when people take a piece of wood and replace it so it looks new, because suddenly I can't see the hardware marks or the ghost from the latch that used to be there that held the door closed. You know, there's all this information that you lose. And I view archaeology as you dig it up and it's gone. And, you know, until we have that test pit archaeology done and analyzed and we understand what that tells us, why go any further? Because all you then have is a pile of data. And the longer you have data unprocessed, it becomes junk.
So you're really not, my understanding that you were saying it wasn't appropriate. It sounds like what you're really saying is it's not appropriate now without that first look at.
And maybe we could learn most of what we think we need to know just analyzing what we already have.
But you got it, you got 6,000.
You know, for the lab, the material lab, also I've designed, you know, just done crude designs, but you could have panels that you lift up and move over and do archaeology under the addition. There you could go to town because you're not disturbing or creating a problem with people using the other space. And so I can see then archaeology below the floor being a viable way to do archaeology. I mean, the other problem we have is on the addition. Do we have to dig down and do archaeology for every footer? Or can we come up with a way of driving pipes in and have some sort of support system that we can put our footer on top of and not have to do archaeology? You know, is it better to do it or not to do it? Can you get the money for it? Can you interpret the materials that you take out? You know, there's 50 questions for every answer you come up with.
So the 100,000 for the trench, it's running that high because you have to do archaeology as you trench?
Right, and it's
That's
you
what
know,
drives
the
the cost
price,
of the
the price is there.
Yeah.
That's how we got the price. But how deep do we have to go? How wide do we have to go?
So
How
just
far do
digging
we-
a ditch is no big deal, but it's the fact you have to do archaeology. if you
No,
do.
it's the archaeology that's the expense.
Okay.
Yeah. And if you're hitting, you know, maybe under the house you don't hit anything. But if you don't hit anything, then why were there shells underneath? And, you know, until we do a test pit under the
Right.
house.
One more question?
So my question is, in the report, what documentation was used to be able to state that African-American caulkers lived
Okay.
in that house? And if you know that, do you have any names?
Yes, the 105-page document should
Right.
be available on the web.
Oh, okay.
and all the research that we did, and all the city directories that were looked at. And it was all documented, where, what, who, what we did find, what we didn't find. So if that can be put up on the web,
Is it on the
that's a
web?
great starting point.
Is it actually on the web or no?
I don't think so, right?
I'm not sure.
I looked, it was at one point several years ago, but I looked in the last 6 months and could not find it.
Whose website would it be?
I would say, it was something that we did for the Preservation Society, so it's a product of the
And so
Preservation
they would
Society
put it up.
legally.
Okay.
So the more information we have, the better off we are. So we can go back and see what is available now and what could be, of use could be put on the site.
It would be wonderful for
Very
people to fill in the gaps.
Yes.
It'd be so helpful.
By expanding that, we sort of expand our knowledge of Fells Point in general, and also of Baltimore City, and how Baltimore fit into a regional economy. Because Fells Point, in the early 19th century, up to the Civil War, was an economic engine here in Baltimore, and a lot of things happened here, innovations, new thoughts. So we want to look at that and bring that out to the public's attention. So, and I think this is a marvelous start to look at, as Bryan says, objects that really are considered to be, very, very common. And so why should we look at them? We should look at them because they reveal a lot about the society in which these people live and which we see today. Thank you for coming. And if you have interest in volunteering for working with Bryan or finding out more about the Preservation Society, please call the number or go on the website or stop by the visitor center. But the Preservation Society is here for people to learn more about the history of the neighborhood and of Baltimore. So please join us in that effort. But anyway, thank you again, and put Thursday, May the 11th on your calendar for the next lecture.
David has refreshments downstairs.